All right, Sarah, are you seeing the presentation?
Yep, you're all set.
Okay, perfect. All right, so thanks again for joining us, everyone. This is our 5th session of our series, Let's Talk About Abortion. So this session is going to be on managing difficult conversations around abortion, opposing stigma, and confronting misinformation. So just a quick overview of the agenda. The first thing we're going to talk about here is how to decide whether to have the conversation in the first place. We're going to talk about identifying your purpose as you engage in these conversations and the most productive audiences to have these conversations with. And then once we get through that, we're going to talk about some best practices for once you have decided to have a conversation with someone. So just as an overview of what that will look like, we're going to talk about the importance of pivoting to your values, focusing on empathy and common ground as we have these discussions. Some thoughtful hints about language, just some things to think about as you're presenting these discussions, some tips for engaging online carefully, some corrections to misinformation that we see a lot during these conversations, and then a conversation about prioritizing your emotional safety. So let's get into it. When we're choosing to engage, like I said, the first thing we want to do is evaluate the audience that we're engaging with. So these are the top people that we want to talk to as we're having these discussions. First, we want to talk to allies, people who are already on board, people who understand the importance of access, understand the nuances of some of the things we're discussing. We want to prioritize talking to policymakers and thought leaders, people who really have impact on these issues directly at the legislative level. We want to talk to supporters of access to abortion care. And we want to talk to those who may be open to new information. Perhaps they're on the fence, perhaps they're unaware of certain nuances of this discussion and they're open to new information. We really want to carefully think about whether or not to engage with anyone making blatant attacks on science or medicine. Once we get into the space where we're kind of discussing, where we're arguing about facts or arguing about science, we know that there might not be a lot of progress to be made in that space. And as we're thinking about the purpose for these discussions, we want to be really thoughtful. If you can't identify a realistic or ideal outcome from the engagement you're considering having, your energy may be better spent elsewhere. Particularly now after the overturn of Roe v. Wade and Dobbs, what we're seeing are a lot of really fragmented fights on abortion access. In thinking about things like the mifepristone case that we're seeing in Texas, and thinking about some of these smaller state fights and state referendums that we're seeing, there's a lot to be paying attention to and a lot of fights to be had. So the last thing we want to be doing is getting burnt out on conversations where there might not be a realistic ideal outcome. So as we're thinking about that, some of the goals that we want to have for engaging are to win hearts and minds. Again, thinking about those people who might be open to new information, kind of bringing them over to the side of abortion access, of understanding some of the specifications of this issue. We, again, want to focus on changing policy, on hopefully increasing access, decreasing restrictions. We want to have these discussions to demonstrate productive conversations for others. So this is an aspect that I'll talk about a little bit throughout the presentation, that when we're having these conversations, especially if we're having them online or in public forums, don't just think about the direct interpersonal interaction that you're having, but the people who are watching this interaction as well, because you may be having a discussion with a person who is at one place on abortion and abortion access, and there may be people who are open to new information or who have impact on these issues who are observing these conversations, and there's always a good chance that something that you say resonates with someone else. And then finally, a great purpose for having these conversations is kind of what we're doing right now, to strategize with allies, to get on the same page with everyone who is with us in this fight. So once you've decided to have that conversation, we're going to talk about some best practices for doing so. So one thing that we've found that can be really impactful is focusing on values and empathy. Again, like I said, having discussions or having arguments about facts doesn't tend to be productive. So pivoting to values and reframing the conversation on the impact of misinformation or of stigmatizing claims, the impact that that has on people who need abortion care and people who provide abortion care. So some of those values that tend to resonate really well with people are the concepts of health and well-being, of autonomy and agency, freedom and dignity, rights, justice, and equity. And so as we're having these discussions, it can be helpful to find common ground between you and the person that you're discussing it with. So if you feel like a conversation is starting to get out of hand, something as simple as we can both agree that people need affordable, high quality healthcare. That kind of thing can de-escalate and bring the conversation back to your core message and back to some of these other values that we're talking about. So it's also important to be thoughtful about language. First, we never want to get caught up in a disagreement or in a conversation and answer questions that we're not sure about or give information that we don't feel really solid on. We want to avoid using technical terms or jargon whenever possible, trying to make our language and our arguments as easy to understand and easy to discuss as possible. And then finally, being careful with the language that we're using so that it doesn't stigmatize abortion or abortion care, including the patients who receive it or the people who provide it. So some examples of stigmatizing language might be full-term abortion or late-term abortion. What we want to say instead is abortion later in pregnancy. The reason the term full-term abortion is not necessarily very appropriate to use in these conversations is that it was largely developed by anti-abortion activists and intentionally kind of creates this vagueness around what an abortion later in pregnancy actually entails. It's not a medical term that is used by professionals at all. We also want to avoid, if possible, terms like pro-life or anti-choice. We want to get specific about what we actually mean, which is often anti-abortion. What we've found is that a lot of people who might be open to new information feel like these terms like pro-life, pro-choice, anti-choice are actually pretty reductive to some of the more nuanced opinions that they have about this. We want to avoid saying things like abortion is only a small part of what Planned Parenthood does. They have a lot of other resources. While we know that this phrase often comes from an excellent place, what we want to pivot to is being proud of our full range of reproductive and sexual healthcare services, including abortion. When we kind of shy away from the fact that Planned Parenthood provides abortion, which is healthcare that we're proud to provide to the community, that can kind of stigmatize the issue. We want to avoid language like termination of a pregnancy, and speak more toward the actual act of abortion or ending a pregnancy. Rather than self-induced abortion, we want to try to say self-managed abortion. A component of this issue is just that self-induced abortion has a lot of stigmatized ideas attached to it. We've talked about how we don't want to be emphasizing this language of a back alley abortion or something dangerous or scary, because again, it can be stigmatizing. What we know is that self-managed abortion under the care of a medical professional, and particularly when abortion is kept legal, is a very, very safe and normal medical procedure. We want to avoid saying things like unwanted or unplanned pregnancy, and again, if we can avoid it, even unintended pregnancy. The reason that we want to say either unintended pregnancy if you must attach something to it, or simply just pregnancy, is because we don't want to qualify the situations in which abortion is appropriate. What we know is that everyone's experience is unique, and we don't want to be talking about abortion care in terms of when it might be appropriate or these specific hypotheticals, but rather just referring to a pregnancy and a person's unique experience. Avoid the term surgical abortion. This is kind of an outdated term, and say instead in-clinic abortion. This is again a similar situation to the discussion of a self-induced abortion versus a self-managed abortion above. We want to sort of switch to some language that's less stigmatized, has fewer sort of dangerous or like back alley implications attached to it, and reinforce that these are very common, very safe medical procedures. Instead of saying things like reduce the abortion rate or keep abortion rare, Again, you can imagine how this kind of stigmatizes the normal healthcare of abortion. What we want to talk about instead is keeping abortion safe and legal and encouraging comprehensive sexual education and reducing unintended pregnancy if possible. Still understanding that pregnancy can happen and every individual's experience with this is very unique and different. So these are just some tips and best practices that we have for engaging online. First, we want to prioritize privacy and safety. Sometimes this can really be no joke. There are some dangers to engaging online, particularly with radical opposition. So it's really important to be thinking about the information that you're putting out there for your own personal safety. We want to lead with values in every piece of communication. Just like I said before, having a disagreement about facts with someone who's committed to misunderstanding this information isn't necessarily productive. It can be really important to pivot back to those values that we talked about that really resonate with people, such as health and well-being, rights, justice, and autonomy. We want to focus on the message, not just on responding or replying to each individual false statement that we see. So this is for a couple of different reasons. First, it's a lot more effective to use social media to reinforce what you stand for and the organizations that you see that are doing great work that you support and really highlighting that positive information rather than arguing with each individual point someone else is making. Kind of puts you on the defensive and it prevents you from putting out some of this really helpful positive information that we can point to in some of these discussions. And then finally, it can be important and really valuable to illustrate your points with examples or anecdotes that connect a reader or a person that you're discussing these things with to the real experiences of people, really humanizing this issue and talking about the actual implications that this has on patients and on providers of abortion care. So as we go to the don'ts, first, we don't ever want to repeat the opposition's language. And this goes for retweeting or quote tweeting, including repeating hashtags or even sharing really outrageous news articles that we see, even if you're quoting it or retweeting it with an added comment about how ridiculous it is or the specific points that you're counteracting. A lot of the time, this can just extend the reach of the opposition. So we don't want to be giving them a megaphone. We don't want to be sharing their ideas farther than they're going to reach anyway. It's really important to highlight the positive information that you want to get out that's factual and helpful. If you are going to put forward the opposition's message, it's really important to respond directly to the incorrect information and not just assume that the person reading it knows why the claim is outrageous. Be really clear about the information that you're giving and really highlight the message that you want to get out there. And then finally, and we've discussed this a little bit, but avoid getting into the weeds or using technical terms and acronyms. It's really important that in today's society, when we see that that attention is really at a premium, and people are kind of just flipping through things quickly, it's important to make sure that the messages that we're giving are loud and clear, easy to understand, and that a person who doesn't necessarily have a lot of attention to pay is understanding your message in that moment. So Sarah, before I move on, I see that there are a couple of chats. Are there any questions so far?
Yeah, we have one question so far from Sarah K, wondering what is the difference between terminating and ending a pregnancy?
So, and again, some of this can really sound like semantics, but the importance of it is really the meaning that has been attached to it and how frequently the opposition has used it. So when we're thinking about the phrase terminating a pregnancy, often it's used by anti-abortion activists who are trying to add some amount of malice or violence to the idea of an abortion. What we want to be clear about is that it is simply the ending of a pregnancy. It complicates the conversation a little bit less. And then was there another question, Sarah?
Nope, that's it so far. But if folks have other questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll pause again and have a Q&A at the end. So we'll get to them.
Sounds good. Thank you. Okay, so what we're going to talk about right now are some common points of misinformation or arguments that we'll see a lot and some effective responses to have to them. As we're going through, I'm going to kind of break down the anatomy of the effective response based on some of the best practices that we've talked about already. And then once we go through a couple of those, I'm going to ask for a little bit of audience participation in the chat. So the first one that we can see kind of frequently is the fact that opponents of abortion misrepresent and speak inaccurately about viability or about fetal gestation. So something that you might hear from the opposition is viability is possible much earlier now and has changed since Roe was decided. An effective response to this can be any healthcare provider will tell you that every pregnancy is different and circumstances can change quickly. Throughout a person's pregnancy, their health needs should drive important medical decisions, not a political agenda. One-size-fits-all laws have no place in health decisions and result in the criminalization of medical care. So in the anatomy of this response, first, we're not repeating any inaccurate information about fetal viability, about gestational age. We're focusing on and emphasizing the values that we've talked about. So going back to these ideas of health and well-being, of justice, of equity, of personal autonomy and rights. An additional conversation or comment that we might see around fetal viability or gestational age is also abortions are sometimes performed up to birth or at full term on viable fetuses. So what we know is that the idea of up to birth or full term is not actually something that happens. These are not medical terms. These are terms that are tossed around intentionally by opposition to mislead and confuse people about the idea of gestational age. So an effective response can be that 91% of abortions are performed before 13 weeks of pregnancy. Abortions performed after 21 weeks are rare and make up only 1% of all procedures. When abortions are performed later in pregnancy, it's often due to complications with the fetus, to protect the health of the pregnant patient, or because of restrictions on abortion access, causing significant barriers and delays in receiving care. So the anatomy of this response is first that we're providing accurate information. We're meeting this misinformation with scientifically accurate information. And this statistic in particular is from the Guttmacher Institute. I'll have a link to that later in the presentation, and we can go ahead and put that in the chat as well. And then in addition to that, we're connecting it back to the real experience of patients and providers. What we know is that this is easy to humanize, that often abortions performed later in pregnancy are due to very specific situations in which people need care and are making difficult decisions for their own personal health. So another thing that we'll see in these conversations kind of frequently is that opponents of abortion care try to make medication abortion care seem dangerous and want to make it harder for people to access this care. This is something that we're particularly seeing in the mifepristone case right now in Texas. So something that you may hear is the abortion industry is pushing dangerous chemical abortions. Too many women have died and more are being hospitalized for them now. We know that this is blatantly false. So an effective response that we can have is medication abortion care is safe and effective FDA-approved option for ending a pregnancy. Medication abortion has created more possibilities for care, including self-managing a safe and supported abortion at home or in a place of a person's choosing. As laws about abortion care get more restrictive, the risk associated with self-managed abortion is more legal than medical. So the anatomy of this response, again, we're not repeating any of the false information that's been presented. We're instead giving accurate information. And then we're emphasizing those values again of health, well-being, rights, and autonomy. So, okay, so that was the last one where I'll kind of break down the anatomy for everyone. And this is where we can do a little bit of audience participation. So I'm going to give you a really similar slide here. And as I read through the inaccurate claim, what you may hear, in an effective response, if anyone who's interested wouldn't mind just dropping in the chat some of the anatomy of this response that you see, whether it's a pivot to values or anything like that. So what we'll see often are inaccurate claims about when a fetus can feel pain, and that's being used to make abortion seem inhumane and to take the focus away from pregnant people and the actual patient. So what you might hear is something like fetuses can feel pain, so we should outlaw abortion after the first trimester. An effective response to this can be, throughout a pregnancy, a person's health and well-being should guide important medical decisions. According to the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, a fetus is not capable of feeling pain until at least the third trimester. As a pregnancy progresses, a patient must be able to make their own decisions with the advice of the healthcare professional they trust. So, is there anything in this response that we're seeing from best practices that I've talked about before that anyone wants to call out in the chat? Oops, sorry about that. I paused screen sharing to take a look at the chat and I lost my way. All right, so a few of the things that we're seeing here, again, instead of repeating any inaccurate information, we're talking about I see one in the chat. Sarah, would you mind reading it to me?
Yeah, so Sarah K just put correcting inaccurate information. And I believe that acronym is mentioning the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. So pivoting to the correct information versus repeating that false information.
Awesome, thank you so much. Yeah, that's exactly it. And then at the end, we're again reinforcing these ideas of a patient being able to make their own decisions. So that autonomy, those rights, that justice. Okay, so here's another one. There's often a misunderstanding of the real life impact that outlawing abortion has. So what you might hear is the idea that restricting abortion reduces the number of abortions that are performed. An effective response, and what we know, is that abortion restrictions do not prevent abortion. They only make safe abortion more difficult to access. Research shows that abortion rates are roughly the same in countries where it is legal and illegal. When abortion is performed by medical professionals, it is one of the safest medical procedures, 11 times safer than giving birth and twice as safe as receiving a shot of penicillin. So what's the anatomy that we're seeing here?
I believe this was in response to the last example, but Leslie said in the chat, also focusing on the health of the pregnant person, really making that the focus of your response.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Leslie. So yeah, again, here we're kind of shifting the conversation back to the real world impact that restrictions have on people who need abortion care and people who provide abortion care. So it doesn't prevent the need, it just makes abortion more difficult to access. And then again, presenting accurate information that it is very safe when legal. All right. Okay. So we also kind of frequently see misunderstandings about abortion funding. So what you might hear is the idea that someone doesn't want federal tax dollars to be used to fund abortions. An effective response can be that the Hyde Amendment prevents any federal funds from being used for abortions and has since 1976, except in very rare cases. So this means that patients who are insured through Medicaid cannot use it for abortions. In the 16 states which recognize abortion as healthcare, state funds are used to pay for all or most medically necessary abortions for Medicaid enrollees in that state. So this is something that can be really kind of challenging to talk about, especially if we don't want to go into those spaces of using jargon or getting super in the weeds. But talking about funding is often a pretty important part of this conversation. So as you're doing this, it's important to really balance that accurate information without getting too detailed or too specific on things that aren't necessarily helpful to the conversation. But again, we're providing accurate information rather than repeating the misinformation. Any other comments on this one before I move on?
I think we're good to move on to the next.
Okay, so then this will be the last one. So anybody who hasn't participated and might be interested in doing so, please feel free to drop in the chat. So sometimes we see misunderstandings about who has abortions and why, and these can often be used to stoke emotional or inaccurate arguments from opposition. So you might hear things like, people would never have abortions if they knew what it was like to have a child. An effective and accurate response can be, it's important that all people have the opportunity to make the best decisions for themselves and their unique situations. Additionally, most individuals who have had abortions are already parents and are making the choice to end a pregnancy out of concern for their ability to care for and provide for their existing children. A survey in 2014 found that 59% of patients already had one child they were caring for. So what are we seeing in this response?
I think we're going to pause a little bit longer to really give y'all a good chance to type in your responses. We want to hear from you. So take a minute, and I know sometimes you're rushing to type, so we'll give you a sec. That's a great one. Debbie is saying focusing on facts rather than emotions.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Debbie.
Another great one from Abigail, focusing on the uniqueness of each abortion story.
Yeah.
All right, we'll give it a few more seconds and then we'll move on. We have a question from Sarah Kay. Who did the study? Do we know who did the study in 2014 that's referenced here? And is there more updated information about this?
So I pulled this stat, I think about a month ago, so I don't think there's updated information, but this is from Guttmacher Institute as well. I think that's actually my next slide, that there is a lot of really, really great information about reproductive health and abortion access on this website. And it can be really good to kind of bolster some of these conversations and bringing some fact and some specificity as we're having these conversations. So I definitely recommend checking that out.
I think that's all we have in the chat for now. So I think we can keep moving forward. Thank you, everyone, for stepping in. We have a little anecdote in the chat. Trudy Benson came to Rochester from New York City before Roe. Mhm. Oh, that's interesting. Thank you for sharing, Bruce.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. And any other, I love the participation. So any other thoughts that anyone has as we're going through, feel free to drop it in. Okay. So the last thing I want to talk about is maintaining your emotional safety and taking care of yourself as you're having these conversations. So conversations about reproductive health care and justice are really emotionally charged, and they can be really upsetting. And that makes sense because these conversations are not just about rhetoric, they're not just about semantics or proving a point. They're really about the future of our rights and of the access of those people that we love. So these can be really personal discussions that can be really hard to have on a regular basis. So it's important to be checking in with yourself. Walk away if it's becoming clear that there will be no productive end. Sum things up by saying, it doesn't seem that we're going to change each other's points of view, so I'm ending this conversation. Maintaining your energy to be able to continue this fight and not engaging in conversations or in discussions that are not going to be productive is not necessarily defeat. It's just you maintaining your energy to continue doing this important work and maintaining the energy to have a conversation with someone who might be more ready to hear what you're saying and might be more impactful. So be aware of that burnout, check in with yourself, as I said, just keep those things in mind as you're having these discussions. In summation, if you don't remember anything else, some really important things to keep in mind are don't get defensive. We want to remember not to just be responding to each individual point that we hear, especially when those individual points are largely misinformed or inaccurate. We want to be presenting our accurate information, presenting our accurate arguments for why abortion access is so important. Don't wing it and don't speculate. Don't ever respond to anything or make a point that you're not entirely sure about. It's really important that we are only sharing information that we know to be accurate and true. Don't fill empty space. If you're having a conversation with someone and you're not hearing anything back, it's not necessary. It's okay to have a little bit of silence here. It's not necessary to fill it. And it can often be kind of a difficult trap to fall into if you start to fill empty space. It is often when people are most likely to say things that they don't necessarily mean, to speculate, to give information that they don't know to be completely true. So get comfortable with that silence. Often it also means that you've made an exceptional point and that someone is kind of trying to evaluate how to respond. And then again, just not using jargon, not using technical terms, keeping these conversations as approachable and understandable as possible is really important. So that is our last content slide. So I think Sarah and I can open it up now to anybody who has any questions, any comments, and just kind of get some conversation going here.
I'm just going back into the chat a little ways. Bruce, you had a question, and I know we went past it. So if you want to ask it again and give a little bit of more background.
Well, actually, I was going to reveal an incident that occurred in about 1995 or 6, if that's appropriate. There was the anti-abortion people were blockading a clinic that also handled just visits by pregnant women. And this woman came up who was obviously very, very, very pregnant, and they refused to allow her in. She explained that she was there simply for her very last checkup, her health checkup before her birth date, which was imminent. They wouldn't let her in and wouldn't let her in. Finally, she had to walk away from her appointment, sobbing, crying profusely, because of this transgression of her right to even go in for an exam to make sure that her pregnancy was progressing to the point where she would have a reasonably safe birth. End of report.
Thank you, Bruce, for sharing that. That is heartbreaking. And we still see, anti-abortion protesters interfering with care today. Luckily, we have some laws in our area, in our state, that help prevent those types of things from happening. But we do see that kind of thing. And I think part of your question was about, like, is it effective to share a story that is a little bit older, like, not present day, but from, say, the 90s? And I would say so. Meredith, feel free to jump in. I think it can be useful to kind of remember how things used to be and how things have changed and not changed. Sometimes that's very eye-opening for folks to realize that, something happened in the early 90s and we still see these things happening today in 2023. And how far have we really come, or how far are we actually moving backwards? So feel free to jump in, Meredith, on that one.
No, I agree completely. I think that's a great point. And especially when we are seeing some of these really heartbreaking backslides on the hard work that's been done before Roe and since. So I think it can be really helpful to bring up those anecdotes and those experiences.
Am I still on? If nobody else wants to jump in, I'll jump in again. Trudy Benson, who was a volunteer of the year here in Rochester, way, way back, told stories about holding the hand of a girl who got a back alley abortion and holding her hand while she was dying. Tough place for anybody to go, even for a nurse, to have to hold the hand of a young girl from a back alley abortion while she died.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think an important thing when we're discussing those anecdotes, because they are so visceral and they can be really impactful and really help people understand the gravity and the concern around backsliding and not having access to abortion. And at the same time, we want to balance having those really visceral, really impactful anecdotes with emphasizing how safe abortion is when it is medically observed, when it is readily available. So it can be a tricky balance to strike, but keeping both sides in mind is really important when you're having these conversations.
Yeah, I like to emphasize for folks that how lucky we are to have come so far and have very, very safe options for self-managed abortions. So folks can safely and effectively have their abortion at home. And as we see access disappear in a lot of ways for folks, that's becoming reality for a lot more people. So it's really amazing that we have these safe options for folks to utilize. Yeah. Any other questions or comments, thoughts?
Am I talking too much? I'm reminded.
No, go right ahead. Yeah.
I'm reminded of the Charge of the Light Brigade, the poem Into the valley of death they rode, cannons on the left side, cannons on the right side, and on and on and on. And the thing you have to remember, in spite of all of the difficulties, they won the battle. They persevered.
Thanks, Bruce. Yeah, I think that, and thank you, Debbie. I think that that is such a good point to make, that Roe was a heartbreaking loss. We know that. But what we also know is that the right to an abortion has never been enough to guarantee access to abortion. And so what we're seeing now is a lot of people taking a really heartened battle to increasing access and to making sure that as we have these conversations now, it's not just about a right to abortion, it's about making sure that everyone actually has reasonable access to it. Beyond economic barriers, beyond geographic barriers, it needs to not be about how much economic access you have or where you live. As we're reframing this discussion and continuing this fight, we want to make sure that we are including everyone in this conversation. And as upsetting as it is, it's really an opportunity to reimagine access for everyone.
Yeah, I think that was a really great way to kind of wrap up the night, Bruce. Yeah, this is our opportunity to come back stronger, to create more access for more people. So that's a good lens to look at it through, some hope and optimism.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, do we have any last minute questions, any last minute comments before we wrap up? Wrapping up a little bit early. It looks like the sun is still shining, so hopefully everyone can go enjoy it a little bit after the very long winter we've had.